Welcome back, everybody. I hope everyone is having a great start to second semester. I know I'm excited to be in second semester, have new classes, new people in those classes. Always exciting and fun. This week, for Family Time 234, we're talking about seeing each other. And what I mean by that is kind of talking about some of the empathy and social awareness things we've talked about before, like really trying to first read the room a little bit, read people's nonverbal cues to get an idea of what they might be thinking, what they might be feeling, but also trying to really see each other, like take the time to actually understand other people. And that's really the foundation of empathy. And a lot of times what we see is very surface level stuff, and we tend to make assumptions about people. And I was thinking of a couple different stories from college, right? Like meeting different people in college. It's for me at least, a very fun time of life. You get to meet people. I got to meet people and play football with people from all over the country and from very different backgrounds than me. And that was a wonderful experience. And I think about some of those things like remembering the initial sort of judgments that I made or assumptions about people from seeing them. And one of the first ones was with a guy who wound up becoming one of my best friends named Scott. And I remember actually seeing Scott for the first time. I'd shown up the first day when all the football players would report to camp and we're moving into the dorms and stuff. And it was a little different back then where there weren't as many activities and stuff ahead of college where you would maybe meet people. I met a couple of the football players at some recruiting things, but that was about it. So we were showing up and kind of meeting people for the first time. There wasn't social media to check out different people on the team, things like that. So I'm kind of just showing up. I was nervous, and I see this guy right when I walk into the dorms. And first, this dude looked older than me. He looked like a grown man, I'm this 18-year-old kid, and he looked like a grown man, which I find out he was. And Scott became one of my best friends. I wound up living with Scott. But Scott's actually 6 years older than I am. So when I was 18 years old moving in, he was 24 already, and he'd lived a little life and actually kind of came back to college. He's from Washington State, actually. And he found his way through kind of a series of events to Upper Iowa. When I first see Scott, Scott's kind of short, kind of sawed off. I don't know how tall he is, maybe 5'7", something like that, 5'8", maybe. And he's big, muscular guy. I used to joke that he was built like a Ninja Turtle, right? Really no neck to speak of, just a face that went into his chest, right? When you say he used to have his beard so you could separate his face from the rest of his body. So he's this big, thick, muscular guy. And he was sitting in this chair and just looked like an intimidating guy. He had kind of that receding hairline a little bit, you got the power alleys going, which is funny because he still has his hair and I don't have mine. So, kind of just stayed at that point. And I said, big muscular frame. He was wearing these kind of shorter athletic shorts, and he had these tattoos. They were kind of half sleeve tattoos, bands around his thighs. And he had these big muscular thighs, these tattoos. And I'm like, oh, it's kind of a tough tattoo. And he had a labret piercing, a piercing right here, like a stud. And when he talked and stuff, you could see, we used to joke about this too and became friends. He actually never grew in 4 of his adult teeth. So he's got a gap in between all of his top front row teeth. It looks like the Michael Strahan gap, but it's in between all of his teeth. So we used to joke that it looked like his tongue was in prison, right? So this is I'm seeing Scott for the first time. Geez, this guy looks like a dude. And I find out he's a fullback. I'm like, oh man, that guy's a fullback. And I'm coming in to play defensive line. I'm an undersized guy. I'm like, this guy looks kind of scary. I'm gonna get destroyed by this guy. And it was funny. I think it was on a first road trip or something like that. that we wound up like chatting a little bit. And I was like, hey man, like this guy's a lot like me. He's into like nerdy stuff that like I'm into. In fact, like one of the most recent times that I went out to Washington to visit him, one of the first things we did was he got out a bunch of old comic books when we were looking at comics and stuff. So I'm like, this guy's like a dork like me. And we really hit it off and like had a good time and everything. And from different backgrounds, like I said, he had kind of lived some adult life after high school and decided to come back to college, decided he wanted to play football. And he's 24 and I'm 18 and he's from Washington State and I'm from Iowa. And so it's kind of crazy, but like getting to know him, I found somebody who's kind of like a kindred spirit. We wound up living together as roommates the next year and stuff like that. We spent a ton of time together. And I think about like those snap judgments we make on people, just like, oh, we recognize this thing about them and we kind of build a story. Even if we're not trying to do it in a judgmental way, we have a reaction to people, like an initial reaction. And that can be kind of a dangerous thing. Another story I think of, short one from college, was this, we had this buddy Keith. Keith was a defensive end, so I played defensive line with him. And Keith was from like the Glades in Florida, like kind of backwoods country folk. And Keith, when you come in at the beginning of like football camp, they would, in the dorms, if you were living in the dorms like as a freshman or whatever, they'd usually room you with another football player. Well, some of the guys that you maybe start rooming with, like, wouldn't really make the cut. They'd kind of wash out of the football program, wash out of school, and then they might leave, right? So Keith had this double dorm room, but the guy that he initially roomed with for camp, like, left. So he had a double dorm, but just by himself. And one thing that nobody really expressly told us was that, like, in the middle of the year, like this time of year, is when we would get JUCO transfers come in, like the junior college kids typically after their 2 years, when they're looking for 4-year schools, we'd get a lot of the JUCO kids in the middle of the year, or, which was the case in this one, in Division II, which I played as like this weird island of misfit toys, sometimes you'd have D1 kids who were dropping down, like maybe their grades weren't so good or they got in trouble or something happened at the D1 level. So that semester they're dropping down to the D2 level. You don't have to sit out time even if you had like an academic thing if you're dropping down a level. So unbeknownst to Keith, one day when we're getting like the transfer people in, there's this former D1 guy that they put to room in Keith's dorm, but nobody really tells him. So we're sitting in my buddy John's dorm room. It's like after classes, we're just hanging out, and all of a sudden Keith like runs in the room, kind of like, guys, it's like there was a giant man asleep in my dorm. And we're like, what? Like, yeah, this huge guy is sleeping in one of the beds in my room. Like, did you talk to him? He's like, no, I didn't know what to do. I'm like, well, let's go wake him up. So we walk over there, and it's like poking a grizzly bear. Big Sheezy was what we called this guy. Big Sheezy was 6'8", 340 pounds. So he was like this giant grizzly bear of a man. So we kind of like, tentatively approach this guy. Looks like a Sasquatch. And we kind of like, shake him gently, and he wakes up like, oh. And we're like, oh, hey man, how's it going? And he was like, oh, sorry man, they told me to come here, nobody was here, I didn't know what to do, so I just laid down and take a nap. And Sheezy became one of our friends too, but it's just like funny. Sheezy was like this super mild-mannered guy, and just the initial reaction Keith had of like, there's just a giant man in my room, like what do you do with that? So again, those are kind of like silly stories a little bit, but we do that a lot. We do that a lot in school. We do that out in the world. And it's good to be aware of people. It's good to notice people. It's good to notice if somebody seems off. And that is an important thing. And that's something we'll talk about a little bit more in class. But I want you thinking about times in your life where you've maybe had an initial impression of someone, and then you got to know that person, and your impression changed. Because that's a good entry point into being a little more empathetic. understanding that our initial reactions, our initial impressions aren't always accurate. Now we have to be aware of those things. We have to be aware of the initial impressions we might be making on other people, especially in like career settings. You come in for a job interview, you got one shot at making that initial impression. So that's important to understand. And it is also important to understand, that's another thing I want us thinking about, is signs that people might give us if something's wrong, right? And the more we get to know people, the more you can pick up on those signs. If a friend of yours, somebody you have a relationship with, maybe they're just being a little quiet or something, and you know that them being quiet is maybe kind of a sign that, hey, something's up. And my advice there is like, just ask, man. I try to do that, like even with like my adult friends and stuff. If I just feel like they're a little quiet or a little worked up about something or stressed out, it's like, just ask. Like, hey man, you good? You seem a little off today. What's the worst that can happen? I mean, best case scenario, they're like, no, I'm good. I'm just tired, whatever. Cool. Maybe something is going on and they might need somebody to talk to. So we're going to talk about that this week, just seeing other people, kind of practicing those empathy skills, recognizing that our first impressions aren't always accurate, and getting to know people by actually talking to them. All right, until next time, much love.